Okay, so have you ever, you know that feeling when you make a decision based completely on fear,
Yeah.
and then it just kind of spirals out of control?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Happens all the time.
Today, we're going to dive deep into that very human experience with Abraham and Sarah in Genesis chapters 20 and 21.
Right.
And get ready, because this is not your typical Sunday school lesson.
No, not at all.
We're talking about fear-based lies, divine intervention, and a whole lot of laughter in some of the most unexpected places.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, how these chapters, they really show us that tension that exists between our own human flaws and then, like, God's unwavering faithfulness. I mean, here you have Abraham and Sarah, these pillars of faith, right? And they're making choices that are completely driven by fear.
Yeah.
And yet, even their mistakes somehow become part of God's, like, bigger plan.
It's like God can take our messy human choices. I mean, we see that all the time.
We do.
And somehow weave them into this, like, beautiful tapestry.
Absolutely. And it's just a good reminder for all of us that even when we mess up, we're not off the hook,
Right.
Like, we're not out of God's story.
Yeah.
But let's rewind a little bit,
Okay.
back to the beginning of chapter 20.
Okay.
So we find Abraham and Sarah, they're entering a new territory. This one's ruled by King Abimelech. And things get a little complicated.
They do. And it's not just a little fear.
No.
I mean, Abraham, he tells a pretty big lie.
He does.
He claims that Sarah's his sister,
Right.
leaving out that whole wife part,
Yeah.
because he is terrified that Abimelech is going to have him killed so that he can, take Sarah for himself.
Yeah, he's afraid.
And it really makes you think, how often does fear drive us to make decisions or choices that just make things so much more complicated than they need to be?
Oh, I think all the time.
Yeah.
We're always trying to, like, protect ourselves when really we're just digging ourselves a deeper hole.
Right.
And the really interesting thing here is, like, the story actually gives a voice to Abimelech's perspective on this.
Yeah.
So imagine, right, you're a king going about your business and suddenly you're woken up by a message from God in a dream.
Oh, my God.
Can you imagine?
That would be terrifying. I can't even imagine.
And he's warned, right, that taking Sarah would be like a huge sin.
Oh, wow.
And he's understandably upset with Abraham for putting him in this position. And I think that's something that we often miss, like we don't always get to hear Abimelech's side of the story.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Because it's easy to get, like, caught up in Abraham's fear.
Mm-hmm.
But Abimelech is like an innocent bystander here.
Completely.
And this really illustrates how the choices we make, they have ripple effects,
They do.
They can impact the people around us in ways that we don't even realize.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
yet, even in the midst of all this deception, you see God intervening,
Yeah.
protecting Abimelech from sinning, but also protecting Abraham and Sarah in spite of their dishonesty.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really powerful reminder, that God's grace, it's bigger than our mistakes.
Right.
Even when those mistakes end up hurting other people.
Yeah.
It's a good thing, too, because, I mean, how many times have we been there, right?
Oh, yeah.
We make choices out of fear. Sometimes we really mess up.
Right.
But what's so encouraging, at least to me, is that even then, God is still working.
Yeah.
He's still protecting.
He is.
And ultimately, he's still moving towards his purpose.
That's good.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a good thing. And speaking of God's purpose, chapter 21, it takes us on a bit of a wild ride when it comes to promises being fulfilled,
It does.
but not always in the way you might expect.
Well, that's the thing, right? You would think after that whole situation with Abimelech that maybe Abraham and Sarah, they would have learned their lesson,
Right.
about trusting God.
Right.
But then we get to this promise that, and let's just be honest, it seems impossible.
It does.
We're talking about Sarah at 90 years old,
90 years old.
giving birth to a son. 90. I mean, come on. I'm picturing, like, what do they have back then? Like retirement communities?
I'm sure they had the ancient Near Eastern equivalent,
Right.
some version of it.
But seriously, can you imagine the weight of all of those years?
Yeah.
Like decades of waiting and wondering, and then, like, completely against all odds,
Yeah.
Sarah laughs.
She does.
And I don't mean like a polite chuckle, right?
Okay.
I mean, this is like deep belly-shaking laughter. It's just erupting from this wellspring of joy and disbelief.
Yeah, it's no wonder they named the child Isaac, which literally means laughter.
Right. It's like this beautiful symbol that's
Yeah.
woven right into their family story, right?
Yes.
But I think it's also more than just a symbol.
Okay.
Like, imagine that. Imagine naming your kid Laughter
Yeah.
after years of just agonizing waiting.
And I mean, it transforms their sorrow into joy, right? Doubt into belief. I think that's the radical hope that we see in Sarah's story.
Yeah.
And it's such a powerful reminder for us today.
It is. It makes you think about those things in your own life that maybe you're tempted to give up on.
Yeah.
Those promises that feel impossible.
Oh, absolutely.
Because God doesn't really work on our timelines
He doesn't.
or with our limited understanding, right?
No, not at all.
His timing rarely makes sense to us. But Isaac's birth, it's just this clear reminder
Yeah.
that God is not bound by human limitations.
He's not.
With God, anything is possible.
Right.
But I do have to ask this, though. So we've got Sarah and Abraham over the moon about Isaac's birth, but where does this leave Hagar and Ishmael?
Oh, that's a great question.
Because their story takes it takes a different turn, right?
It
It's
does.
a little more complicated.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's important that we don't shy away from this part of the story.
Yeah?
Because it really forces us to confront some things that are maybe a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, and it's really easy to get so caught up in the joy of Isaac's arrival that we kind of gloss over Hagar and Ishmael's story.
Right.
But it really does cast a different light on what's happening here.
It does.
And it's a side of the story that I don't think we talk about nearly enough.
We don't. And I mean, it's a side of the story that's full of just raw emotion.
Yeah.
And our source here really captures the rawness of what Hagar's going through. I mean,
Right.
she is sent away, right? Banished into the wilderness with Ishmael. Can you even imagine the fear
Right, and the uncertainty.
and the uncertainty?
Like, what do? You're completely alone. You have
Yeah.
a child to care for.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's heartbreaking to think about it. And it kind of forces us to confront this idea that, even when God is orchestrating events,
Right.
there's still this human cost.
There is.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet, even in that desolation, right, even in that wilderness, when Hagar is completely ready to give up, God doesn't abandon her.
Right.
And he doesn't appear, in some grand display of power,
Right.
but with something very simple, something essential, a well of water.
It's such a powerful image that this well that she couldn't see before
Right.
is suddenly there, made visible in her moment of deepest need.
I love that. It's such a good metaphor for
Yeah.
how God often works in our own lives,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We can be so blinded by our own fear, by our own despair, that we completely miss the resources, the help, the hope that are right there in front of us.
Yeah.
We need God to open our eyes, right?
Right.
To help us see that well in our own wilderness.
Right. Right. And, it makes you wonder, too, what is going through Abraham's mind through all of this? Because this isn't just some, abstract command from God.
Yeah.
This is his son.
It
This
is.
is his family.
Yeah, and it's heart-wrenching, honestly.
Yeah.
Our source actually points out that Abraham loved Ishmael deeply. And so to send them away, this caused him real pain.
Of course.
But he chose to obey God.
Right.
Even though it hurt, even though it was difficult.
I think that's something we probably all struggle with.
All the time.
Just this tension of wanting to obey God.
Right.
But also knowing that sometimes that obedience comes with really, really
Yeah.
difficult
Absolutely.
consequences.
It's hard.
It is hard. It is hard. But, there's this interesting kind of, this thread of grace that I feel like is woven into all of this.
Yeah.
Because if we think back to Abimelech,
Right.
he started off as this wary stranger, right?
Yeah.
Caught in this web of Abraham's deceit.
Yeah.
But he ends up recognizing God's presence in his own life
He does.
and seeking to build this covenant of peace
Yeah.
with Abraham.
It's true.
It's almost like this full circle moment where you start with this fear and deception, but then it ends with forgiveness.
Yeah.
And this shared kind of recognition of God's power in both of their lives.
That's really good.
Yeah. So we've gone through a lot in these two chapters.
We have.
A lot of twists and turns, a lot of, high points of joy, low points of sorrow.
We've seen it all.
We've seen it all, yeah. But through it all, you really do see God's faithfulness shining through.
Yeah, I think that's the main takeaway for sure.
And I think it's a really good reminder for all of us that God's story, it's so much bigger than our own. And his plans, they often unfold in ways that we can't even imagine.
Right, and sometimes
They-
those plans require us to really trust him,
They do.
even when it doesn't make sense, even when it's hard, even when it hurts.
Yeah. Well said. Well said.